Hi, my name is Bill Nash. I'm a former Navy psychiatrist who spent the latter years of his 30-year career with the Marine Corps, deployed to Iraq and then later headquarters Marine Corps, and now I do research on PTSD trajectories, prevention, early intervention, and moral injury. Moral injury as a concept certainly is as old as sin. You know, the Judeo-Christian concept of sin with shame and moral staining of the person, and the Greek cultural concept of miasma, which probably appeared around the same time between 500 and 1000 BCE. Very similar. And I've got on this slide a quote from the New Standard Version of the Bible from Genesis chapter 4, after Cain slew Abel, I guess is the right word. And he said, and it's written in the text, Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." Just think about what overwhelming magnitude of shame that is, that, you know, his face needs to be hidden from God and from his fellow men, and anyone who meets him having done this terrible deed can kill him because he has somehow earned that consequence. Now I'm going to compare that to a couple sentences from Euripides' play called Heracles from 424 BCE, during which time the Greek concept of miasma as a moral pollution was gaining popularity. And so, I don't know if you know the story of Heracles from Euripides. Hercules is a mythological person who, you know, demigod, who's reputed to have done a lot of different things. But in Euripides' version of Heracles, Heracles comes back from his 12 trials, comes back to his home, to his family, and he's been through a lot of war. He's done a lot of killing, seen a lot of horrible stuff, and he comes home to his family. He's greeted by his stepfather, his real father, Zeus, I guess, and he's preparing to undergo the ritual cleansing ceremony that at that point in Greece was considered a communal ritual to cleanse the moral stain of war, the moral pollution, literally to wash it off your hands. As he was doing this, he had a dissociative flashback, and in that moment thought his wife and sons were enemies in his house that invaded his house, and he killed them all. And it was, you know, some minutes later when he was unconscious and they tied him up, and as he woke up and realized what he had done, I mean, it took a while. All he sees is destruction. He says, "Where's my wife? Where's my sons?" And these are the words that he spoke, according to Euripides. "What can I do? Where can I hide from all this and not be found? What wings would take me high enough? How deep a hole would I have to dig? My shame for the evil I have done consumes me, soaked in blood guilt, polluted, contagious. I am a pollutant in offense to gods above." So the two pervasive themes about this idea of wrongdoing and its consequences that really, you know, date back to these ancient times, and two of the consequences are shame, you know, and one of the hardwired, I'm sure, genetic responses we have to the feeling of shame is wanting to hide, you know, hiding our faces. Shame and unforgivability. That's the other really compelling thing about back then. It seems that there weren't mechanisms for people to sort of work it off. And, you know, the Christian idea of purgatory is a place to work off those moral stains before you can go to heaven. We don't have a purgatory on earth. And in ancient times, you know, the consequences of a moral transgression was often death. So that's ancient times. I'm going to fast forward now to the 1990s and draw attention to three authors, I think, who really contributed significantly to this developing concept of moral injury. The first is Ronnie Janoff Bowman, and I've got another slide for her, who published a book in '92 called Shattered Assumptions, subtitled Toward a New Psychology of Trauma, which really described what she believed were three fundamental assumptions that we all have and have to have about ourselves and the world in order to just exist, morally, emotionally, psychologically. And those three assumptions are, number one, the world is benevolent. It's a good place. Number two, the world is meaningful. This isn't just random chaos. And the third assumption is the self is worthy. So it's a good world, I'm good, and this all makes sense somehow. And you know, she arrived at these conclusions from seeing how ubiquitous in trauma survivors of any type were shattering or damage or fracturing of those assumptions, so that, you know, she saw the main consequence of trauma, of, you know, significant repetitive trauma from someone that you know should be taking care of you. It's no longer being able to see the world as good and benevolent, no longer believing that there's any meaning in any of this, it's just a sham, and also not believing that the self is capable of goodness anymore. So Judith Herman wrote this amazing book on trauma, also published in '92. It's one of the most quoted people from, you know, ever to write in this about this topic, who also worked with rape survivors and childhood abuse survivors. And she was one of the first people to coin a term that I think will have increasing relevance as we go forward, particularly in military veteran populations with moral injury, and that's the term complex PTSD. It's not really well defined any place. There was an attempt made in one of the DSMs, I think it's DSM-4, to create a category called dissociative disorder not otherwise specified, but really it's, most people think of it the way Judith Herman first described it in '92. And that is trauma that not only creates a fear conditioned response, not only creates fear as an isolated part of your life, but that damages who you are as a person. So it's trauma that damages one's identity and one's ability to modulate your emotions, your ability to modulate your behavior, basically creates what in the first DSM was called a situational personality disorder. And that's kind of a, you know, for people in the mental health field to think about Axis II personality disorders as being something that's lifelong, you know, it's from childhood, and if you get to adulthood and you don't have a personality disorder, you never can. But the whole idea of complex PTSD is you can develop what looks just like a personality disorder if you have complex PTSD. If you have been traumatized, and it's usually, you know, well, I believe, and I know Jonathan Shea believes, that this is a consequence of moral injury. In the early studies on this, Judith Herman, as I said, they studied, helped, treated people who had repeated sexual abuse, violence, children who were molested over many years, ritual abuse. So that was the context in which they conceptualized this idea of how do these events damage the person and make them no longer able to control their impulses, to do the right thing, all those things. But there's a growing literature that this is also a consequence of war. And war is also, the way it's been practiced in the last 10 years, is repetitive. It's, going out, many deployments over the course of a few years, and each deployment could have, who knows, dozens easily of significant traumatic events and significant moral injuries. The third person I want to mention from the 90s who was instrumental in the development of this concept of moral injury is Jonathan Shay. He used the term moral injury in his first book, Achilles in Vietnam, at least twice, in this specific context. He's not the first one ever to put those two words together, but he was the first one to say in his chapter 1 that he believed, as he convinced me in his mentoring of me early on, that, just having your life threatened is something most people can get over. But it's when there's a moral injury, a damage to your moral identity, as I'm going to talk about more in a second, when that's not possible. I'm reminded of a conversation I had at Headquarters Marine Corps, 2005 or so, talking about this with the then Commanding General of TCOM, Training and Education Command at Headquarters Marine Corps, and I was a 2-star general, and he said, "Doc, are you telling me, you're talking about PTSD in general, are you telling me that if I walk across the street and I almost get hit by a car and I jump out of the way, my heart's pounding, and later that day I shudder to think about it, maybe I have a nightmare that night, that tomorrow I'm going to have PTSD?" I said, "No, sir, of course not." And I wish I'd thought of it then, and it's been, just boiling in my mind ever since then. I didn't come up with the right answer at the time, but here's what I wish I could have said. I said, "No, sir, that probably would not be something, especially, a trained warfighter such as yourself would, cause you any long-term problems. But what if, same scenario, you're walking across the street, car almost hits you, you jump out of the way, you're fine, but someone else walking beside you gets hit and killed. And you did not prevent it. You didn't pull them out of the way. What if that someone else was your son, your wife?" Totally different scenario, totally different meaning. One that clearly involves more of a damage to your beliefs about who you are as a person, what your responsibilities are to the world, to people you love. That's what moral injury is about. So, Jonathan Shay was the first one to make use this term this specific way in veterans, and to link it with the undoing of character, which is a term he used, which I think was a beautiful term, which really kind of speaks to complex PTSD and how a person's moral character, moral identity can be damaged because of these experiences. Not because they're horrific, but because they violate what you believe to be true and necessary to your existence. Okay, fast forward to, I've got a few more contributors I want to name from the last few years. And the first one is 2006, a philosopher of ethics currently at Marquette by the name of Elizabeth Urban Walker wrote a book called Moral Repair. Her premise, this is a philosopher, not a psychologist, not a mental health professional, not a chaplain. Her whole premise for this book is that in moral injury situations, the victim ends up holding the bag. There are things society can do to try to, restore the balance of good and evil and do justice by, punishing the perpetrator or whatever. But what can they do about the victim? The victim is left holding the bag. You can't, how often as a victim of someone else violating your rights, such as a rape, such as, sexual assault in the military, how often are you going to get any kind of, even an apology? So her premise was moral repair has to be the responsibility of the community, of moral communities. Basically, her idea was that, moral injury occurs and moral repair is necessary when our shared moral covenant is violated. And we define that covenant. We say, as a society, as a culture, what is right, what is wrong, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. Different for the military than it is for maybe civilian cultures, which is a huge part of working with veterans and service members, is to realize what are their cultural expectations of right and wrong, what do they expect of themselves. But Walker's idea, I think, is a great one, and that is that this is a responsibility of communities. No one else can do it, and if we don't take on this responsibility as communities, then these morally injured people are walking around really spreading moral injury. Moral injury begets moral injury. The next little step in this progression is 2008-ish, when the Marine Corps convened, well actually they convened in 2007, a working group of champions from the 3 Marine Expeditionary Forces, MEFs, which the Marine Corps is a tiny military organization compared to the Army, Navy, or even Air Force. So the actual, one corps is all they have. And the Corps, the Marine Corps, is three expeditionary forces. Each one is a division, ground combat, air combat, logistics. And in 2007, the commanding generals, 3-star generals of these 3 MEFs, sent all their champions together to San Diego to hammer out their view of how they should promote psychological health and manage combat and operational stress in Marines. And at the time, I was pitching this idea that there was something in between normal and PTSD. In between those extremes, there was sort of normal reversible stress, but there's a line that can be crossed where stress can no longer be managed, where it does actual physical, psychological harm to the person. And I call that a stress injury. It was in reaction partly to my suggesting that there was this thing called stress injury in between normal and screwed up for life that didn't sit well with some military leaders, and for a whole lot of reasons. It kind of flew in the face of some long, established cultural beliefs and leadership, and they didn't want people raising their hand the night before a battle and saying, I can't fight tomorrow, I have a stress injury, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, they pulled together these champions, and they came up with the stress continuum model, which is a color-coded system. And this is Marine warfighters who did this, not mental health professionals. There were chaplains who were very much involved in the discussion, many of them, a few mental health professionals, mostly warfighters, line officers. And they said, you know what, we agree that there are actually 4 different stress zones a person can be in. And this stress continuum model then is a tool, a language for evaluating and communicating, talking about what zone a person is at any given time. And green zone is, you're good as you're going to get. Yellow is where we live all the time. Yellow is good. Yellow is reversible stress that's for a limited period of time. and it makes you stronger. I mean, that's what training is about, education. This is all yellow zone stress right here. But orange zone is when you have been pushed beyond some limit because stress was either too intense or lasted too long. And I don't know if you can see in this graphic, but they agreed that there were 4 sources of stress injury. There are 4 different kinds of stressor types that could push somebody into the orange zone. And realizing that, like any injury, you cannot uninjure yourself. So once you get in the orange zone, you're not the same anymore. You know, you may come back better than you were before, but you have to heal first. So 4 different causes of stress injury: life threat, fear-based events, loss, so permanent separation for someone or something that is cherished, wear and tear, which is the accumulation of all stress over time without sufficient, recovery, and what they called inner conflict, which is exactly the same as moral injury. There have certainly been, problems with the terminology. I'll talk more about that in a second. But it's really inner conflict and moral injury are really the same thing. So the last 3 steps in this journey, and it's far from done because the moral injury concept is still, it's growing at a much greater rate than it ever did before. There's so many people in so many parts of the world working on it. But these last 3 steps I want to mention. 2009, Brett Litz and his colleagues published a paper in the Psychology Review Journal, very definitive paper defining moral injury and moral repair. I think that's awesome. He also suggested an approach to cognitive behavioral treatment of moral injury. 2011, Kent Drescher, David Foy from California published a survey. It's the first empirical study of moral injury. They surveyed, I think, 25 chaplains and mental health professionals, and they asked them questions about, do you think moral injury is real? Do you think we need this term? Do you think it's the right term? What are some events you think can create moral injury? What does it look like? What are the symptoms? And I think what they reported was about 1/3 of the people said moral injury is a good enough term. 1/3 said moral is good, but injuries shouldn't be there. And the last 1/3 said injury is good, but moral shouldn't be there. It should be spiritual or something. So, but it was a great step forward, at least getting people's subjective impressions of what are the events that cause moral injury and what does it look like. So the last step in this journey that I'm going to mention today, as I said, there's so many more, was a publication last year of a validation of the moral injury event scale, which Brett Litz and I and some others did as part of the Marine Resiliency Study. So you can see here that asks about specific events. It doesn't ask about the consequences so much, just the events as a first step toward some kind of empirical basis for moral injury. And there are 2 main factors that came out of the factor analysis. The first factor is doing something or not doing something or witnessing something or having something done to you that appears to violate your moral code. And each person gets to decide for themselves what that means, what they consider morally right or wrong. It's in the eyes of the beholder. And the second factor, just the last 3 items, are betrayals. Betrayed by leaders, betrayed by fellow service members, betrayed by others. And this is in the public domain. The validation paper was published in Military Medicine in 2013. But I think the value of this is that this was validated in a cohort of combat-exposed Marines. And we correlated PTSD symptoms and depression and anxiety symptoms post-combat, and this was a longitudinal study, so we evaluated them before and afterwards. We found that the score on the moral injury event scale actually predicted PTSD symptom severity better than the combat exposure scores. better than questions about how many times did you get blown up or shot at, or how many times did you pick up body parts and those kinds of things. I want to start the discussion of moral identity by badly quoting something that Plato wrote, and that is one simple quote is, "Virtue is knowledge." But it's often re-quoted or paraphrased as something like, "To know good is to do good." And Plato and Socrates, whoever he was quoting, had this idea apparently that the only thing that stops people from doing the right thing is not realizing it's the right thing. And that if you had the capacity to do accurate moral reasoning and moral assessment, you would naturally always do the right thing. Well, that's caca. That's just not true. You could educate a young child, a 6-year-old child, and I'll say 6 because it's before this magical age of 7 where somehow moral identity is supposed to have formed. So a 6-year-old child, you sit them down and you teach them everything there is to know about right and wrong. That doesn't mean they're going to stop stealing someone else's candy, right? It's just not happening. So there's a lot of research, growing body of research by moral psychologists and others showing people do the right thing often without knowing it's the right thing. So the moral reasoning step can be bypassed completely, or people can know it's the right thing and just not do it because they don't care enough or whatever. So obviously it's more complicated than that. And that's where this idea of moral identity comes from. And there's a literature on this that I'm only just beginning to learn about, but it's the idea that moral codes can be internalized over the course of one's lifespan to become what can be called a person's character or moral fiber. And it's that internal moral identity that motivates you or doesn't motivate you to do the right thing, no matter what reasoning process you go through in whatever the situation. So but the important pieces of this moral identity concept are, number one, it doesn't just appear in anyone's life at any given point in time, age 7 or at any time. It's really a lifelong process of gradually becoming your values. You know, this old saying, character is what you do when no one's watching. Moral identity is what you do when no one's watching, right? Where you do the right thing not because you're afraid of getting punished or someone will think less of you, but you do it because it's who you are. That becoming that moral force is the process of developing a moral identity. So that's the first important thing about moral identity, is it develops, if at all. I know we all know people who probably don't have much of a moral identity at any age of life, but those who do have it, it's a lifelong, slow process. That also means that people who are younger than middle adulthood, let's say the average age of an enlistee in the military, someone who's 20, 21, their moral identity is nascent. It's just a baby, right? So their ability to make good moral judgments based on their knowing and being right is, is very fragile. So that leads me to the second consequence, important factor related to moral identity, is it can be damaged. It used to be thought that, whatever personality, structure, character one developed over the course of a lifetime, is set for the rest of your life. That's who you are. Well, I do consulting work in skilled nursing facilities, and I can tell you we are all headed for destruction of our character and personalities. It just, because you need neurons. You need neurons to have an identity, to have morals, to behave morally, right? So that's an extreme, one situation in which these things are lost through dementia, through aging. But strokes, traumatic brain injury, TBI, and stress injuries, whether it's from, life threat trauma, losses, all of these things, just impact, degrade the ability of the central nervous system to do the jobs of a moral identity. So the second concept I want to talk about is moral emotions. And this is something I've only recently been learning about. Jonathan Haidt from New York is one researcher who's been doing some work on this. And moral psychologists are now becoming interested in moral injury, and they have a lot to say about it. And one of their conceptualizations is that we are all hardwired genetically from, before we were even human beings, to respond to certain situations of conflict with a certain set of specific moral emotions that are mostly pro-social, in the sense that we have these emotional reactions as signals to tell us there's a social conflict here and we should do something about it if we want to get along, right? So there are negative moral emotions and positive ones. The negative moral emotions can be either towards oneself or towards others, and guilt, shame, regret are the most commonly talked about negative moral emotions toward the self. Negative moral emotions towards others are contempt, anger, and disgust. Now, guilt and anger are easiest to sort of see as pro-social. So if I feel angry with you, it may mean that you have truly done something to offend me, you have violated my rights in some way, and this will motivate me to say, hey, give back what you've taken, or somehow make it right. If I feel guilt, it's just the same coin turned upside down. So it may be a signal to me that I've taken something from you and I should repay. Shame is kind of harder to see in that context, whether that's really helpful in any way. But I'll talk more about this in a second. But at first I want to talk about the positive moral emotions: pride, awe, and elevation, which are, just those words carry so much weight. We all know what these things feel like. And that's one of the things I think that proves that these are genetic, hardwired emotional responses, is we all know exactly what these things mean. It doesn't matter what culture you live in, what time or place, you know what guilt, regret, shame, anger, pride feel like. So here's the thing I want to make about moral emotions. We often talk about our moral emotions as if they were truth. As if, now it's the consequence of an appraisal, so some part of our brain has appraised the situation and decided that either you did something wrong or I did something wrong, and hence the emotion. But it's an appraisal by a very old, ancient part of our brain that is not capable of processing a whole lot of nuance. So the first thing I think to in working with people who feel intense moral emotions, these are the most intense emotions a person can feel, I think, especially shame and anger, is to realize that they may not be accurate signals. Give an example. It's a real common, simple example. Children from birth on react to frustration with anger. They cry, they yell, they scream, they kick, they bite, they have tantrums. Does that mean that we have morally wronged them? Is their anger justified and real, right? So obviously the more mature we become, the more integrated our moral codes, moral identities, the less inaccurate these moral appraisals might be. But you just don't know from the emotion itself. So what I'm saying is, my point is this: people who feel guilt or shame or anger or contempt, regret, they're making a moral appraisal that could be right, it could be wrong, it could be both. And the process of recovering from that, of healing from that, of reducing the sting and damage from the emotion itself requires a higher level of information processing. It requires really thinking through, you know, well, what is my culpability, your culpability, and not just reacting to the emotion as if it's truth, which I think is problematic. The next point I want to make is that I believe, you know, one relatively simple way to conceptualize moral injury is it's a damage to the person's moral identity, which is their owning a moral code. Moral code that's not something that is applied to the outside of them. It is in the center of who they are. It's their core. And it doesn't matter who's watching, who's not watching. It doesn't matter with, you know, what the consequences are. They know it's right or they don't know it's right. So I'm suggesting that in order for something to really be moral injury, that the event and its consequences have to damage that moral identity. And that, you know, what exactly that looks like, we don't have any metrics for this, we don't have any empirical way of determining this, but I think it's important to start drawing a line between moral debts, moral affronts, and moral injury, and injuries to one's pride. So I think these are things we need to have some way to parse a little better. In my mind, you don't have moral injury unless your moral identity, your personal 24-hour-a-day relationship with morality has been damaged. And it has to affect your life in other situations other than just this one relationship. The next little tidbit, I wish these things all came together in more of a coherent form, but they just don't yet. I'll leave it to you to work that out, is comparing moral reassurance and moral repair. Obviously, if moral injury is damage to someone's moral identity, given that an identity is something that takes a lifetime to build in the first place, you're not going to rebuild a damaged identity in one interaction, in one moment. It's just not possible. But sometimes caregivers, in their desire to be helpful, and this is not just professionals, it's everyone does moral reassurance. You know, something bad happens and you say something like, oh, it's not your fault, or someone does something bad to you, you didn't deserve it, or even in a spiritual level, God still loves you. You did the best you could. You couldn't help it. These are common things people say in relationships all the time, and it helps take the sting out of negative moral emotions. And depending on the nature of the event and how deep the damage went, it may actually be helpful. But if somebody's had a real damage to their moral identity, the worst thing to say to them is, you did the best you could. That's what it means to be a warrior, what it means to be a defender, is that's the burden they take on. When they take the oath to defend the U.S. Constitution, it means that, just like police and firemen, there is no good enough. The only good enough is accomplishing everything that you set out to do, saving every life that could be saved. And so the last idea I want to throw out there is empathy and self-empathy. That seems to be for anyone who's had a moral injury, it seems that the goals for moral repair are acceptance and forgiveness, which are really two different things. And I'm not sure which is harder. Acceptance, I guess, sort of seems to mean that you're okay with the world being as it is, right? I'm okay with, no longer having my left leg, having a dent in my head, with not being able to control my anger when I play with my child, whatever. I'm okay with it. I don't hate myself anymore. I don't know. It's acceptable. Forgiveness seems like it's a step further, and it may be easier to see the difference when you're talking about someone else. You can accept that someone did something to violate your expectations and beliefs, but to actually forgive them, to take them out for a beer, that's a whole nother level. That empathy is one of the hardest, like integration. It is a lifelong task for everybody. We can get better at it by experiencing empathy from other people or from the divine to the extent we're capable of experiencing that. We can be taught, but it's something you have to work at. But that has to be the target. That has to be the goal, because anything short of that is destructive. There's no other way to resolve a moral conflict, a moral injury that's not destructive, that doesn't involve someone dying. Either I kill myself because I'm unacceptable and never will be acceptable, or I kill someone else because they're unacceptable, unforgivable. The only way to really not end up in that point is forgiveness and acceptance.